Live now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Climate Change Authority's webinar on our second report of the Special Review. I'm very happy to welcome you all to this discussion. We're relatively new at webinars. This is only the second one I think we've ever done. So there'll be a bit of learning by doing as we go along, I think. So in a moment I'll ask my colleague Kath Rowley to take us through the presentation that we've developed, which is based on the options paper that we released in November. But I might just take a couple of steps back first and take you through a little bit of the background. So firstly, about the authority, for those of you that don't know, it was formed in 2012 to provide independent advice to the government and the Parliament. And we currently have 10 members, including the Chief Scientist. And of course, public consultation is a very important part of the reviews we do, which then inform the advice that we provide to the government and the Parliament. So this webinar is part of this public consultation process on the special review. And we're going to be covering 4 broad topics. So firstly, the purpose and context of the special review, the range of policy options that Australia has available to reduce emissions, including the different types of carbon pricing policies, the approach to evaluating policy options that we outlined in the options paper, and finally our consultation process from here. So just a bit of housekeeping and logistics firstly. Kath's presentation will take about 30 minutes and then we'll take questions. We've actually got, it would appear, rather a large number of participants, so we ask that you type your questions into the box on the right hand side of your screen throughout the presentation, and then we'll collate them and we'll go through as many of them as possible afterwards once the PowerPoint's finished. If you do lose sound or visuals during the presentation, can you let us know by calling our colleague Shell Lyons on 1386563011. So as I mentioned earlier, that this is a briefing that's really focused on engaging with the stakeholders. If you're actually part of the media and you'd like an interview or to ask some questions in that regard, then could you please contact our media advisor, Aileen Muldoon, and she can be reached on 0419 112 503. And we are actually recording the webinar and we'll upload it on the CCA website after we've finished today. So then just a bit of further background on the special review, again for those of you who perhaps aren't that familiar with it. So the Minister for the Environment requested that the authority deliver a special review that was basically had 3 main components that you can see on the screen, hopefully in front of you. The review is actually very broad-ranging in its terms of reference and required that we produce 3 reports over an 18-month period. The first of those reports Australia should take to the Paris conference, and that report was actually finalised in July last year. Earlier last year we also produced a guide for people to use in comparing countries' targets in terms of assessing what their individual targets actually meant for emissions reductions and so forth. The second draft report, which is the one we're really talking about today, was released at the end of November and it's available on our website. And then the final report is due to be completed at the end of June this year. And really one of the ideas of the consultation process that we're engaging on, in which this webinar is part of, is that we collect feedback and your views to help the authority in developing its final report to government and the Parliament, which is the one that's due at the end of June this year. So some of you may be aware the terms of reference require the authority to assess whether or not Australia should have an emissions trading scheme. The authority took the view that the terms of reference, or that part of the terms of reference, are best met by looking at the ETS and in fact the many variations on a theme in the context of a range of other policy tools and also other countries' experiences with carbon pricing and other climate change policies. So in fact, the options paper that we put out did look at various forms of ETSs and carbon prices, but tried to do a little bit of comparative analysis based on the assessment criteria I mentioned earlier in terms of teasing out which would be the best for Australia going forward. And as I said, one of the real intents of this consultation process is to get views from stakeholders on what that might look like. So I think that's probably enough of an introduction. I'll now hand over to Kath to take us through her presentation and the main content of the options paper.
Thanks, Shayleen. So before we dive into policy options and evaluation, just a quick note on why we're here at all. And in what are sometimes polarised climate policy debates, the key goal sometimes we lose sight of, but that's to reduce emissions and to avert the risk of dangerous climate change. So this slide just highlights some of the observed and projected impacts of climate change on Australia based on advice from climate scientists. And these include higher average temperatures with more hot days and fewer cool days, lower average rainfall in southern Australia, with more droughts projected. That said, the impacts on rainfall will vary by location and the trends for northern Australia are more uncertain. But these warming and drying trends are expected to contribute to increased fire risk with more extreme fire days and longer fire seasons. And looking beyond the landscape to the oceans, there's projections for continued acidification of the ocean, which together with higher ocean temperatures is putting strain on our iconic aquatic ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef. Now, these impacts illustrated here are just a snapshot, but they help highlight the importance of global and national action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Turning to the context of the review, both international and domestic factors are important here. The Paris Agreement, which was struck at the end of the UN climate negotiations last December in Paris, is the latest step in global action to address the risks of dangerous climate change. The agreement's very wide-ranging, and some of the key outcomes which are most relevant to the authority's special review are almost universal participation. So we've seen nearly 190 countries put forward commitments to reduce their emissions. There's a stronger and more specific global goal to keep warming well below 2 degrees and to make attempts to keep it below 1.5 degrees. There's also a specific statement of what that requires. So the agreement says that global emissions need to peak as soon as possible, to reduce quickly thereafter, and achieve net zero emissions in the second half of this century. So that's a step up from the detail we've had on global goals in previous agreements. Another key aspect of the Paris outcome is regular reviews, which will over time hopefully make national actions more ambitious. Two key elements. There's the regular global stocktake, which will occur every 5 years starting in 2018, to assess how the world is tracking towards the collective goal of below 2 degrees and potentially 1.5, and then actions every 5 years. And this will be informed by that global stocktake, but each successive commitment put forward by countries must progress beyond the country's previous target and reflect each country's highest possible ambition. If we turn to Australia's contribution to global efforts, the government set a target to reduce Australia's emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. And the government's acknowledged that a range of new policies will be needed to reduce emissions to meet this target. The government's already considering some new policies, for example, looking at vehicle emission standards in the context of the National Energy Productivity Plan. And it will be, it's flagged that it will be considering Australia's emissions reduction policies in detail in 2017. So the authority's special review will be able to inform all of these processes. Turning now to what's all those national pledges add up to, the series of slides I'll show here illustrates the impact of national commitments on the trends in global emissions. So first here we see the global business as usual trend. And you can see that global emissions have been growing since 1990, and absent national actions, that growth is projected to continue, driving greater global warming over time. Now, of course, future global emissions, like everything in the future, are uncertain, but this line presents the median estimates of future global emissions. Now, I've just added on the slide the impact of national commitments that were made in the lead up to the Paris negotiations. And we see some of the big emitters down the bottom and then the rest of the world stacked on top. And the first thing you can see is that the sum of those emissions is lower than business as usual. So that means that national commitments are shifting the trend. They're projected to certainly still have growth in global emissions, but much slower than would be without those national actions. Now, this projection assumes that countries meet their targets, but there's reason to believe that they will. Countries have already got a wide range of policies and measures in place, and many have signalled plans to strengthen and add to those policies in the coming years. Now, you'll see here down the bottom, US and EU emissions are actually projected to fall in absolute terms. It's because they have absolute reduction targets. While China's emissions, China plans to reach peak emissions, so max out its emissions by 2030 or sooner if possible. And so that gap between the top is the cumulative effect of all of those national pledges. Now, how does that track relative to the collective goal? This final slide shows the gap to 2 degrees. So the green line here shows the median estimate of cost-effective pathways to keep warming below 2 degrees. And you'll see that that's significantly below current projections with current commitments. And so it shows that current efforts aren't on track. And this highlights 2 really important factors. First, there's more to do. So global efforts will need to strengthen over time, and that 5-yearly review process, which is built into the Paris Agreement, will be really important here. Second, it means that policies for Australia and other countries need to be scalable. That means that they need to be able to meet not just current targets, but to be scaled up to meet stronger future targets over time. Now we'll turn to the issue of policy options. Emissions come from very many and very diverse sources, and emissions reduction opportunities are just as diverse. There's also a lot of different barriers to the take-up of those opportunities. As a result, it's very unlikely that any single policy will be sufficient to meet Australia's targets in a cost-effective and equitable way. And a toolkit of measures is likely to work better. Now, this figure, which is taken from the International Energy Agency, illustrates how a mix of policies could be used in a complementary way to reduce energy sector emissions. On the left-hand side, there's energy efficiency policies, things like standards and labelling, which can be used to unlock opportunities which are already cost-effective but not happening for a range of different barriers. In the middle, broad-based policies like carbon pricing can be used to drive low-cost emissions reductions. Here it would be in energy supply and use if the carbon price was applied to the energy sector. So things like fuel switching and technology upgrades would fall into that category. And then finally, on the right-hand side, there'd be emissions reductions opportunities which are currently quite expensive, where technology support policies and research and development support might play a role. And that can both help prove up new opportunities, but also reduce the costs of those technologies over time so that they can be more widely deployed across the economy. Now, I'm going to talk through some of Australia's policy options, specifically in detail. So, the authority's November report canvassed a range of policy options as shown here, and we're seeking feedback from you on which are best suited to Australia's circumstances. We've identified a mix of market and non-market policies. So market policies first fall into three broad categories. Now, they all have much in common. They aim to embed the cost of greenhouse gas emissions into the activities generating those emissions. Mandatory carbon pricing makes emitters pay for their emissions through policies like emissions trading and carbon taxes. Voluntary pricing provides financial incentives to reduce emissions without creating obligations for all emitting firms. And then there's other types of mandatory price-based policies which create markets and provide support for specific low-emission activities, for example, renewable energy and energy efficiency. Just pause for a moment. I think we've had a bit of a problem with the slides. Just get this back up and running.
While we're just waiting for the technology, it's probably worth a slide that we put up was just an example of how a package of measures could fit together. The authority obviously hasn't decided on which package of measures, and in fact, as I said earlier, part of the aim of this discussion is to hear all your views. But I do think it's an interesting graphic in terms of how complementary measures can sit together, noting that the choice of actual measures could vary depending on what decisions policymakers decide to make.
Indeed. Okay, so just returning to the types of policies that we're seeking input on. So market-based policies aren't going to resolve problems that aren't to do with price, for example, lack of information or split incentives. And so there's certainly a role for non-market policies too. And these include things like the very wide variety of possible regulatory policies, and I'll give some examples a bit later. And information programs to help consumers have access to information that helps them make good decisions that meet their needs and interests. And finally, innovation support policies that help develop and roll out clean technologies and processes. So I'll now go through each of these in a bit more detail. And I'll start with emissions trading. It's an important, although certainly not the only option, and I'll just take a moment to explain very briefly how it works. Now, this slide gives a simple illustration of how a stylised cap and trade scheme might work compared to a stylised command and control regulation. It's very simple, but it helps illustrate the practicalities. So if we assume that you have two plants, A and B, and each emits 100 tonnes of emissions, giving a total of 200 tonnes. If our policy objective is to reduce those emissions by half so that total emissions fall to 100 tonnes, well, on the left-hand side of this chart, you see how a simple command and control regulation might do that. It requires each plant to, and the issue here is that different plants use different technologies, they produce different products and services, and so they typically have different emissions reduction opportunities at different costs. And here we've got a simple illustration. One can reduce tonnes at $100 a tonne, and plant B can do it at $200 a tonne. Now, if they're both required to halve their emissions, they can do that, but the total cost associated with that approach would add up to $15,000. Now, if you look on the right-hand side, this illustrates a simple cap and trade scheme. It would set a cap on total emissions of 100 tonnes, so it has the same environmental outcome as the regulation. Now, it would divide that into permits or allowances, and let's just assume that each plant gets 50. Now, emissions trading, unlike regulation, doesn't prescribe where the reductions have to occur. And this means that the emissions reductions can occur wherever they're cheapest. So in this example, because plant A can reduce emissions more cheaply, it will tend to do more, while plant B, where reductions are more expensive, will tend to do less. And instead of reducing its own emissions, it will buy those extra permits from plant A. And as a result, you can reduce total emissions to 100 at lower cost. In this example, $12,500 rather than the $15,000 in the regulatory example. So same outcome, lower cost. And this is a simple illustration of why people say that policies like emissions trading, as well as other policies that use market forces, can be more cost effective than regulation. Now, emissions trading is just one of many types of mandatory carbon pricing, and there are lots of different types of emissions trading as well. But the other main type is carbon taxes. And you might have heard a lot about the differences between taxes and trading. That gets a lot of attention, but in fact they have a lot in common as well. So both put a direct cost on emissions. Their impact on emissions levels will depend on the price or the cap or the baseline in a baseline and credit emissions trading scheme, and how that drives or how that compares to business as usual. So what kind of gap between BAU and the cap is implied. Both types of mandatory carbon pricing can be scaled up to meet new and stronger targets. And they both can reduce emissions in a cost-effective way. So rather than prescribing where things or what things have to occur, they provide a consistent incentive across a range of different emissions reductions opportunities covered by the scheme. Now, the key difference is that in emissions trading schemes, the government sets the quantity of emissions through the cap, and you have a market so that permits can be traded. And under the carbon tax, the government decides the level of the carbon price, whereas the level of emissions is uncertain. A couple of examples. So key examples of emissions trading schemes are the schemes that operate in the European Union and California's emissions trading scheme. Whereas carbon tax applies, for example, in the Canadian state of Canadian province of British Columbia. So there are other types of market policies that are outlined in the authority's November report. The two main ones are voluntary carbon pricing and other market-based policies. So first, voluntary pricing. These reward emissions reductions from approved projects and programs. And as the name suggests, participation is voluntary. First type, offset schemes, give credits for emissions reduction projects. For example, that might be reducing methane emissions from landfills or planting trees to sequester carbon. And examples of offset schemes include the UN's Clean Development Mechanism, as well as the crediting element of Australia's Emissions Reduction Fund. Offset schemes are typically linked to some other policy, whether that's an emissions trading scheme or, for example, a government purchase program, which provide the demand for the credits generated by those emissions reduction projects. Now, a key challenge for these sorts of schemes is to ensure that emissions reductions are additional. That is, that they wouldn't have happened under business as usual. So that you make sure that you're paying for something real and that the emissions reductions are actually happening. And that typically requires good rules, good governance and review processes, and sometimes that can increase the transaction costs associated with this sort of policy. Now, because they're voluntary, companies and individuals only participate if they have cost-effective emissions reduction options. and that helps avoid the cost imposts associated with mandatory pricing, where all the liable parties are required to pay for some portion of their emissions. That said, because it's voluntary, it can limit participation, and it can mean that some low-cost emissions reductions opportunities are missed. Now, the second type of market policy is these other mandatory price-based measures. And these create incentives for activities that reduce emissions rather than pricing the emissions directly. Now, a few different types here again, but one example is mandatory renewable energy targets, such as Australia's RET. Under this scheme, eligible renewable generators get a certificate for every megawatt hour of renewable energy that they generate, and they sell these certificates to electricity retailers. And this can help reduce the emissions from electricity generation. Like other kinds of policies, renewable energy targets can be scaled up, but they can only be used to reduce electricity emissions. They won't directly drive broader reductions across the economy as a whole. Another type of these types of policies is energy efficiency target schemes. These are also called white certificate schemes and operate in many Australian states. They work in a similar way to offset programs, so they issue certificates for projects that reduce energy use rather than reduce emissions. These can include things like upgrading energy-using appliances or, for example, insulating homes to reduce heating and cooling energy use. These schemes, like with offset schemes, an important challenge is to ensure that the activities that are getting the credits are additional and wouldn't have happened in a business as usual setting. And one of the upsides of these sorts of schemes, particularly energy efficiency more broadly, is that it can create benefits for consumers. For example, improving access to energy efficient technologies and reducing energy bills. Now, turning to non-market policies, the first and probably biggest category is regulation. And a regulatory policy is one where the government introduces laws and regulations to reduce emissions. For example, they might restrict or ban certain products or technologies, or alternatively, they might require that products or services or production techniques need to meet minimum standards. So, they take the least efficient, for example, least efficient products out of the market and set minimum performance standards for access to the market. Regulation is a particularly good way to address non-price barriers. For example, sometimes there's a split between who pays for an activity and who benefits. Take, for example, a rental property and the energy efficiency of the house. The owner would be paying for the upgrade, but it's the tenant that gets the benefit of lower energy bills. And so owners don't necessarily have an incentive to improve energy efficiency, even where, from a purely economic perspective, it would be cost effective. And regulation can help overcome those barriers. Regulation is very commonly used in Australia and around the world to drive energy efficiency improvements, as well as to limit emissions from certain sectors, such as transport and waste. And some countries have indeed used regulatory standards to reduce emissions from things like electricity generation as well. The authority in some previous work has taken a close look at the regulatory option of mandatory emission standards for vehicles, and so that's what's illustrated on this slide. This shows some of the potential benefits of a standard, including lower fuel bills for motorists, lower emissions for Australia, and greater energy productivity and ultimately financial savings for the Australian economy. And indeed the government is taking a look at the case for vehicle standards as part of its work under the National Energy Productivity Plan. A couple of other types of non-market policies that are outlined in the authority's November report are information programs such as product labelling. It can be mandatory or voluntary. For example, people might be familiar with the Energy Star rating program, which appears on a wide range of appliances used in households. Information programs can also be just things like consumer advice. So there's a website called the Your Energy Savings website, which provides information to interested households on how they can reduce their energy use and reduce their emissions. These sorts of programs can be particularly effective where consumers are willing to take action but are unsure how to do so. And so, looking more broadly across the economy, it means that information programs can have a useful but perhaps limited role in helping Australia meet its targets. Innovation supports the final specific policy I'll talk about, and that's about that support that can be provided right throughout the whole cycle of research and development, from early stage research through to the demonstration and commercialisation of new low emission technologies. A couple of examples from Australia include the grants that can be provided by the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and loans and financial support that can be provided by the Clean Energy Finance Corporation for eligible projects. So that means that there's a lot of policy options for Australia to choose from, and the key question then becomes how to decide which ones to use. And the draft report sets out the authorities' proposed approach to evaluating policy options, and it identifies three basic principles. The first one is environmental effectiveness. Policies which are environmentally effective reduce emissions and help us meet our short and long-term targets, as well as contribute to achieving the global goal. Now, policies, as I've highlighted a couple of times, need to drive new and additional reductions. If they simply reward activities that would have happened anyway, then those policies aren't going to be environmentally effective. Now, there's a couple of considerations that the authority plans to take a close look at in the context of environmental effectiveness, and they are carbon leakage, which can reduce environmental effectiveness. This occurs where a policy causes an activity that produces emissions to relocate to another country that doesn't have emissions limits. So, for example, if the aluminium smelter closed down in Australia and set up shop somewhere else that didn't have a binding emissions target, then the emissions would just move somewhere else and they're not real reductions. And that can reduce the environmental effectiveness of Australia's efforts. Of course, if the activity moved to a country that did have an absolute emissions target or a binding emissions target, then leakage isn't a problem, because, or at least emissions leakage is not a problem, because the other country still needs to meet its target. Now, the other thing we're taking a look at is international emissions reductions. That is, emissions reductions that occur outside Australia. Now, from the atmosphere's perspective, it doesn't really matter where emissions reductions take place. It all goes into the same atmosphere. What really matters is that those reductions are real. The authority plans to consider the role that credible international units could play in helping Australia meet its targets as part of the review. The second principle that the authorities identified is cost effectiveness. And a cost-effective policy is one that helps Australia meet its targets at least cost to the community as a whole. The authority is going to look at different aspects of costs, including the direct costs borne by producers and consumers, as well as how these costs might have knock-on effects in the broader economy.
And actually that's one of the issues that you probably need to think a bit about when you're looking at some of the mandatory pricing options. Just to hark back to some of the conclusions or suggested findings in the options paper, some of these things are arguably quite important when you look at carbon taxes or the various forms of emissions trading schemes. And the options paper goes on to note that actually, if you use a mandatory carbon price, then you might find that you've got some quite high or relatively higher costs going through across the economy, and that's one of the considerations as to why some of these other options for certain sectors or indeed more generally might be things that you want to consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the authority is doing some analysis and drawing on the literature to understand those knock-on effects of the different kinds of mandatory pricing schemes, as well as understanding the impacts of other policies. Now, one of the things that we need to consider in the context of cost effectiveness is scalability. That is, whether policies can be scaled up over time. This is important because to limit climate change, emissions reductions efforts have to be sustained over decades. And so cost effectiveness is not just about minimising costs in the short term, but it's about achieving a low cost transition of the economy over the long term. The third principle that we've identified is equity, and this looks beyond the level of the cost to who bears those costs. Equity inevitably involves value judgments, but there's at least two broadly agreed aspects which we talk about in the discussion in the draft report. The first is that individuals or firms in similar situations should be treated the same. And the second is that costs should not fall disproportionately on those who are less able to bear them. So thinking about things like regressive impacts of different price measures. The authority is going to consider how the costs, benefits and risks of the different policies are distributed, as well as thinking through what steps can and should be taken to address those distributional impacts. Now, separate from the three core principles, there's some other considerations that we're also going to be taking a close look at, including the international competitiveness of Australian business, how policies fit for different sectors, so the kind of horses for courses concept, which is that some policies might work very well in some sectors and not so well in others. And finally, how policies interact with each other, so whether the fit is complementary or whether policies, if you use them simultaneously, will interfere with each other. And the authority is going to be drawing on Australian and international experience to consider what's likely to work here in Australia. Just a final and quick note on international competitiveness. This is a particular concern for businesses that are emissions intensive, so they're particularly affected by climate policy, and trade exposed. That means that they're competing with companies in other countries. Now, the concern is that climate policy in Australia could, in some circumstances, put them at a relative disadvantage in global markets, particularly if their competitors don't face similar obligations. Now, for this issue, it's the detailed design of the policy as much as the choice of policy tool that's likely to be important. For example, if you have a particular policy scheme, you might build in assistance mechanisms for sectors that would otherwise be unfairly disadvantaged. The authority plans to look at the risks and evidence for competitiveness concerns, identify the top priorities and look at the options for dealing with them. And we'll be taking account of the trade-offs amongst those key principles of environmental effectiveness, cost effectiveness and equity. So that concludes our formal presentation. Now the authority is keen to hear from all interested Australians on the merits of these different policy options, noting that those might vary across different sectors of the economy. We'd also value your inputs on the evaluation framework that we've proposed. So do those three core principles of environmental effectiveness, cost effectiveness and equity cover the important issues? Now, the authority provides evidence-based advice to the government, and so we're particularly interested if your submissions could cover off on what your views are, but also why you hold those views and the evidence that supports your position. Now, there's details on how to lodge a submission available on our website, which is the address is listed here. And just to note that submissions are due by the 19th of February. Now, I'd like to thank you all for your attention so far, and we'll now turn to questions. I expect that we've had some submitted as we went along. Shayleen. Okay.
So I think the first one we might have pretty much covered, which was from Daryl Fallow, but perhaps it's worth drilling into it a bit more. He asks, are you looking, as far as submissions from the public are concerned, are you looking more for discussion and supporting arguments, or are you looking for an indication of specific preferred methods or suggested policy approaches of groups or individuals? So look, I think we'd welcome pretty much all or any of those. As Kath says, if you're actually wanting to propose particular approaches or policies or a particular policy suite, if you had some evidence to back up your view, that would be particularly welcome. But otherwise, we'd be very happy to see what you or your group wanted to put forward. Then we have a question from Lloyd Vass from the Carbon Market Advisory, and he's asking, with the cost of domestic abatement generally being in the double digits, what are the CCA's thoughts on using eligible international units to meet a proportion of Australia's nationally determined contribution in a more cost-effective manner? So I think on that one, Kath's presentation and indeed the options paper both indicated the importance of international units and the role they can play. As Kath mentioned, the previous work of the authority has put considerable emphasis on, if you're going to use international units, then you need to be sure that they're robust, and there are various sort of policy approaches that you can adopt to ensure that. I guess there's also the issue of a trade-off between domestic abatement and abatement overseas, and sometimes the binary choice is put in terms of, oh well, if you use international units to achieve the bulk of your target, then you might be missing out on some of the opportunities for transforming your own economy to be less greenhouse intensive. But Kath, did you want to sort of talk a bit about that trade-off and,
Sure.
and what we've found in the past?
Yeah, so the task for the world, if warming is to be kept below 2 degrees, is progressively to decarbonise the global economy. And if Australia is playing its part in global efforts, then there are many people who would argue that Australia should be reducing its domestic emissions. Now, obviously, as we flagged, over time that is the task, and you do need to think not just about minimising short-term costs of achieving targets, but minimising the cost of that transition over time. Now, international units, in the authority's previous work, we've said that if they're real, robust, they do contribute to global solutions, and they have a role to play, or could have a role to play, in helping Australia meet its targets, and they can help reduce the cost of meeting our targets in the near term. But that they ought not detract from that domestic task of reducing emissions, and that you would want to use a sensible balance of domestic and international emissions reductions. And one of the roles of the policy toolkit for Australia, and what we're seeking submissions on, is what mix of policies is going to be achieving our targets in a cost-effective way, but also driving that domestic transition. And we welcome your views.
Okay, we've got a question from Ben Parr, who's said, I'm concerned that the terms of reference include a reference to protecting Australia's international competitiveness, which in Australian climate policy means protecting the competitiveness of fossil fuel polluting firms operating in Australia, vis-a-vis polluting firms operating in foreign countries. This has been a key feature of Australian climate policy since Hawke. How do you propose to introduce strong greenhouse gas mitigation policy aligned with the IPCC recommendations, with this featuring in the terms of reference? So look, I think that raises some really important issues, and the options paper, I think, went some way to trying to tease out some of those issues. One of the points that the authority made in the options paper was you know, you can to some extent the impact on your competitiveness depends a bit on the policy that you actually choose to introduce. So, for example, you know, if you introduced a policy that had perhaps had a less strong effect on the economy as a whole, you might find that some of your competitiveness concerns are less marked. Similarly, as Kath's just saying, with respect to international units, if you made international units available, that might some might see that as a form of assistance that people could use that would still deliver you an effective policy that's reducing emissions while recognising the competitiveness concerns. Of course, some of the carbon pricing options, for example, some of the emissions trading schemes including the EU, had mechanisms in place to essentially give free allocation to firms that they considered at risk of carbon leakage, and some of those could be adopted to deal with competitiveness concerns. So I think it is an interesting problem and a difficult one. The other side of the argument is to say, well, you know, if you're going to try and deal with competitiveness in those kind of ways, in effect, you're putting a stronger burden on other areas of the economy, which means they have to, in effect, do more of the heavy lifting or bear more of the associated costs. The other point that we made in the options paper, particularly with carbon leakage, as Kath said, is as more and more countries are moving towards putting forward targets that go across their economies or require action, you start to find yourself in something that looks a bit more like a level playing field. So the argument might be that over time some of these concerns, particularly around carbon leakage, but also to a lesser extent around competitiveness per se, start to become less pressing. But certainly it is one of the challenging aspects of recommending a policy toolkit for the government. So there's also, thank you, also a question from James Day that points out that some industries have greater capacity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than others. Have the authority considered recommending sectoral specific emissions targets for different industry sectors, such as South Korea has done? So that's a really good question. Did you want to have a go at that one?
So in the draft report, we look at some of the issues of sectoral fit for policies, and we look at identify some of the characteristics of sectors that make them perhaps a better fit for some measures than others. And where sectors have very different emissions reduction opportunities, then it might well be that you'll need targeted measures, whether that's energy efficiency in the household and residential sector, or research and development in sectors that don't have much by way of cost-effective opportunities right now, and so you can tailor those interventions to address particular problems or try and build opportunities over time. Some policies are actually designed to operate broadly across multiple sectors, and so in the report we talk about how different types of mandatory pricing measures could be applied to multiple sectors, and so rather than using a tailored sectoral approach to find the least cost opportunities, you could use market forces and with a broad coverage scheme, let the market find where those opportunities are, and the sectors that have the greatest opportunities make the biggest reductions, and the sectors that have fewer cost-effective opportunities buy the permits instead. That's one approach. Another approach might be to, say, have a targeted scheme to reduce the emissions in the electricity sector, and a completely separate scheme to look to reduce the emissions in, say, fugitive emissions from oil and gas extraction. And there's inevitably going to be some degree of trade-off across the efficiency, the effectiveness and the fairness of those approaches. And what we welcome submissions on is what is the right fit and mix of policies for Australia's emitting sectors.
Okay, we've got a question about co-benefits, which is always a live one. So Stephen Pollard from the Climate Energy College points out that many mitigation actions can bring immediate co-benefits alongside the obvious long-term advantages of limiting the impacts of climate change. So it gives the example of cutting emissions from fossil fuels and vehicles, or electricity can reduce air pollution and bring health benefits. Can the CCA consider cost effectiveness in terms of most benefits to society alongside the least cost measure? So look, it's a really excellent point. And Stephen, if you had an approach or a methodology that you'd like to suggest us having a look at, we'd be very interested to see it. Certainly the authority has been very live to the issue of co-benefits and have discussed that with respect to a number of the policies. I think there's sometimes some methodological challenges about how you actually cost and capture the co-benefits, so we'd be very interested to see what you have in mind, if indeed there is something sitting behind your question.
Yeah. The authority also looked at the issue of co-benefits in the context of the review of the carbon farming initiative that it did a couple of years, not last year, but the year before. And you know, the same issue arises, that the emissions reductions projects often do deliver co-benefits for biodiversity or land quality or human health, a whole range of things. One of the challenges is trying to get climate policy to do all things for all people rather than focus on the central task of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly where there are other policies to address those other goals. So we have biodiversity policies, we have air pollution standards to deal with human health concerns. And one of the things we said in the context of that review was that it's really important that policies are designed to work well together and to think about policy interactions when you design your climate policies, but that in some cases climate policy won't be the best tool to pursue some of those other objectives. And so it's as much about good coordination across government agencies and across levels of government as it is about particular policy design.
Yeah, so then we've got a question from Julian in AEMO, and he points out it seems that one of the main drivers in the paper is a policy reset to get a fresh look. This would have been driven by significant policy uncertainty in Australia over the last decade. While policy stability is mentioned in the paper, it does not seem to be a core factor on the evaluation framework. Can you please comment? I completely agree with the point that I think underpins your question, which is that policies do need to be both scalable and stable, and that's an interesting, possibly a bit of a difficult trick to pull off in some ways. But look, I think we certainly do see it as important. It's not in the framework, not because we don't think it's important, but perhaps partly because it's sort of implicit in some of the other criteria. So for example, a policy won't be cost effective or environmentally effective if you're constantly changing it and doing something else, because you won't then get the investment certainty to start to affect the transformation that you might be hoping to achieve in your economy.
Yeah. I guess the other point is that perhaps any policy can be stable if you put it in place and leave it alone, and so it won't necessarily help you choose amongst policy options. But that's one of the reasons why we've put such an emphasis on scalability, because if you recognise that emissions reduction efforts are going to scale up over time, then you want to put in you might want to put in a policy toolkit that can actually do that. So it's one where you're going to be ratcheting up the ambition of policy over time rather than wholesale chop and change because your new target is more ambitious than what went before.
Okay, then we've got a question from Angus Atkinson who says, given the impact of this policy on farmers, the draft report does not address farmers' issues. And he also asks about why don't we look at the why doesn't the environmental effectiveness look at the biodiversity benefits of schemes? I think the biodiversity benefits question goes to the co-benefits issue we've just been discussing. So I think we've probably covered that one off. On the question of impact on farmers or addressing farmers' issues, the options paper was of necessity in a way fairly brief and didn't drill down into those sorts of issues for any of the sectors or any of the groups that you might be interested in hearing about those particular impacts or views on those. So Angus, we'd be really very keen if you wanted to send us a submission talking through your views on some of those things. We've also got a question from Nari Sahuka from New South Wales Environment Defenders Office. And Nari's asking about the proposed carbon budget in light of the Paris Agreement and whether we still think this is a suitable target. So this issue is one that I think the authority will need to have a look at in terms of what it does for the final report of the special review. They're still working through those issues at the moment, so we probably can't say too much more on that at the moment. But I think it certainly is part of the things that they're going to be considering going forward. Okay, I think those are probably all the questions that we have, and we're probably almost out of time. But look, this is an unusual experience getting written questions and not seeing any reactions from the people we're talking to. So we do hope that people have found it useful, and as I say, encourage you to write early, write often, send us your feedback in the form of submissions to the addresses and so forth on the screen. Okay, well look, again, thank you again, and we might close out from here.